Law number 18 is the law of sacrifice. And the law of sacrifice says a leader must give up to go up. In fact, I can remember several years ago now doing a leadership lesson entitled, You Have to Give Up to Go Up. And into that lesson, I can remember my outline because it was very simple. I said, first of all, and it was about getting up the top. And I said, first of all, you have to get up to go up. Because I know all kind of people, they're still in bed. You know what I mean? They're still in bed. They haven't realized, you probably ought to get out of bed before you can be successful. You got to get up to go up. That's step number one, get out of bed. Enter in the arena of action. Take some initiative. Do something. Okay, you got to get up to go up. And after you get up to go up, after you do that, secondly, you got to grow up to go up. You got to grow up. I know people who have never matured. They're still talking about the same thing, doing the same thing. They've never developed like to. So if you want to get to the top, you don't have to get up to go up. You got to grow up to go up. And then in the tape, I remember I talked thirdly in the leadership lesson about, well, you got to give up to go up. And that's what we're going to talk about in just a moment. And then the last thing I said is you need to gather up to grow up. You need to get your team together. If you really want to go to the top, you've got to gather up people because as I teach in the laws of teamwork, law number 4, the law of Mount Everest says, as the challenge escalates, the need for teamwork elevates. In other words, you've got to get a team around you, and you've got to get that team helping you to get to the top. So let's talk about the law of sacrifice. A few years ago, there was a tragedy at Mount Everest where a couple of guides got into a storm with a few of their people, and there were a few deaths. And I can remember a 60-minute interview that I watched. It was a very interesting interview because they were talking to one of the guides who, of course, lived, and they were talking about the tragedy. I think it was Mike Wallace, if I'm not mistaken, in that interview, and he asked a couple of questions that especially arrested my attention. One of the questions he asked was, why do you risk your life to take people to the top? And I remember the guide said, well, it's because that's my job. My job is to take people to the top. That's why they call me a guide. And Mike Wallace says, well, couldn't you get to the top by yourself without harm or injury? And oh yes, I could do that. But it's my job to take people to the top. And the guide kept coming back to Mike Wallace and said, it's my responsibility. That's who I am. I'm a guide. And when I listened, I thought, how true to a leader that is. It's our job as leaders to take people to the top. Mike Wallace continued that interview, and then he looked at me and said, I don't think it's worth the risk. I mean, after all, to risk your life or have people in your party that not make it to the top, he said, I don't think it's worth the risk. And then he looked at the guy and said, why do you risk your life to get to the top of the mountain? And I'll never forget, that guide looked at him, and when Mike Wallace asked that question, the guide is looking into his face like, I can't believe you would ask me that question. Why do I risk my life to get to the top? He looked at Mike Wallace and said, it's obvious to me that you've never been to the top of Mount Everest. It's obvious to me. You've never been to the top of the mountain. It's obvious that you've never been there. If you would have ever been to the top, you would never ask that question. When I think of that interview, I think of leaders. Once we have been to the top and see how glorious it is, what do we want to do? We want to go back down and we want to find some other people and say, I want you to take a trip with me. I'm going to show you things you have never seen. I'm going to give you experiences that you have never experienced. That's what leaders do. Leaders have been to the top and they want to take as many people with them to the top as they possibly can. Now, here's what I want you to understand. To get to the top, you've got to give up something. It was Emerson who said, for everything you gain, you must lose something. That's why I have in your workbook what I call the leadership pyramid. The leadership pyramid is a prime example of giving up to going up. Basically, the leadership pyramid says that when you enter an organization, I guess you got all kind of options left and right, but as you become a leader, and as you become a leader in that organization, the higher you go in this leadership pyramid, the less options you have. Now, I want to say that I teach this leadership pyramid all the time. I think that most leaders, and I think a lot of leaders in corporate America and in leadership organizations around the world, do not understand the leadership pyramid. For example, I run into leaders who all the time think that the higher they go, the more options they should have, the more perks they should have. I don't think so. I think the higher you go, the less options you have. I think that the greatest leaders are what I would call servant leaders. They're leaders who understand that they're a leader to make it better for the people. You're not a leader to make it better for yourself. Now, if you're a good leader, it will be better for you because you'll have the joy of taking people across the finish line. And there's no greater fulfillment and joy than that. So if you are a leader and you're taking people across the top, it's going to be very good. But what I want you to understand is this. You don't lead because of perks. In fact, what I have found is this. Most leaders, they become leaders because they like the perks of leadership, but most people have not counted the price of leadership. What you're going to have to give up, what you're going to pay. My dad taught me when I was just a kid. He said, John, pay now, play later. That's the way it works. And he said, if you don't pay on the front end, you don't get a play on the back end. In fact, he said, I'll never forget this. He said, John, the longer you wait to pay the price, the higher it becomes. So learn quickly, pay on the front end. And I'm saying to each one of us today, as we're teaching this principle, the law of sacrifice, what we've got to do is we've got to understand that we have to pay on the front end. There's a price to pay to be a leader. It's not always easy. It's not always fun. In fact, when I teach leadership, one of the things I'm most concerned about is, why do you want to become a leader? Do you want to become a leader because you think there are a lot of perks in it for you? Or do you want to become a leader because you want to add value to people and take them to a higher level than they could ever go on their own? So let's go to the workbook. Because there are 3 sacrifice statements that I want to make. Number 1, there is no success without sacrifice. Let's just start there. You say, John, what do you mean? What I mean is, there is no success without sacrifice. There's not an escalator waiting to take you to the top. Quit standing outside waiting for the chairlift to take you to the top. Nobody ever got to the top of a mountain and at the end of the day said, oh my goodness, how did I get here? Instead of saying, I just took a stroll and the next thing I knew, I was on top of this mountain. No. You can fall off the top by accident, but you can't roll to the top by accident. If you get to the top, it's because you gave up something. And let me tell you something that all experienced mountain climbers will tell you. Before they take that big trip to the top, the main question they ask themselves is, what are the essentials I must take with me? Because they know anything except essentials will be a detriment to keeping them from what that goal is. So when they get ready to go to the top, they don't back up a U-Haul truck and say, I'm going to throw this stuff in the truck. I may need it while I'm up there. No, they give up. They give up to go up. So there is no success without sacrifice. Number 2, the higher the level of leadership, the greater the sacrifice. That's a fact. The higher you go in your leadership, the more you'll give up. I remember thinking when I started off in my career, in my business to go to success, I remember thinking in the very beginning, boy, I was willing to do anything to get to the top. Of course it was. I didn't have to give up anything. Hey, when you have no money, it's not hard to give it up. When you have no position or reputation, it's not hard to give it up. You say, well, why was I so foolish as a youth? You weren't foolish as a youth. You didn't have anything. But as you grow higher, one of the reasons many leaders never get to the top is because as they go higher, they get more stuff. And they have to make these trade-off decisions that become very difficult for them. The third thing I want you to know about success is you have to give up to stay up. You not only have to give up to go up, once you get on top, you have to give it up. The reason most sports teams can do consecutive world championships is because after they win their first world championship, all the players go on the chicken banquet tour. And they spend the next year getting fat, telling everybody how they did it last year. And you don't reproduce yourself by telling your story. You reproduce yourself. You stay on top by giving up continually. About 5 years ago, I did a lesson that really fits this whole law of sacrifice. It was entitled 10 Trade-Offs Worth Making. And I was at a very important part of my own career where I was 50 years old. And I was going to have to make some major changes, and I was going to have to give up some major wonderful perks and things I had in my life if I wanted to go to the next level. And I can remember that day as I sat down at my desk with my legal pad and I began to look at the trade-offs. Trade-offs such as I was willing to give up affirmation. People tell me what a good job I was doing for accomplishment to get to a next level. I was willing to give up financial gain for future potential. I was willing to give up immediate pleasure for personal growth. I was willing to give up the quantity of life for quality of life. I was willing to give up security for significance. I was willing to give up acceptance for excellence. I was willing to give up addition for multiplication. I began to work through all these things I was willing to give up. And I can remember making the conscious decision to keep on going. But I also remember, as I looked at that list, I realized that the higher you go, the price gets higher. That's why many people get about 2/3 of the way up and never climb any higher.